Okay, we've made it to World War II. And this lecture is going to be extremely long. I'm breaking it up into several parts, and it's going to take us a while to get through, in part because World War II is, I should think, an obviously huge subject. The History Channel alone is chock full of World War II documentaries, especially stuff about Hitler. It's kind of become a subgenre of books that are best described as dad books or dad history. Like if you walk into Barnes & Noble, if you could walk into Barnes & Noble and look at their history section, it's mostly just like World War II stuff. Civil War and World War II dominate the dad history genre. Which is a shame, because World War II history has something for everyone. It is the single largest event in world history in the 20th century in terms of scope, and it had long-lasting impacts all across the world. So I'm going to start with an overview to talk about some of the most important characteristics of the war. If you're really interested in the minutiae of military history in World War II, your best bet is to watch one of the many documentaries about the war, or better yet, I don't know, pick up a book. You could also look on YouTube. There are many lectures on that subject. Don't just pick random YouTube things. Look for things from the National World War II Museum, the National Archives, universities that put those things out. There's thousands of books just about D-Day alone, I'm sure. Anyway, this lecture is going to touch on some of the major campaigns. I'm going to talk a little bit about D-Day, but I'm not going to be going through week by week, battle by battle. That's not what the purpose of this lecture is. That is the realm of military history. Military history has its place, but it's not in this lecture. To start the overview, however, I'm going to note a military point here. The war was won on the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union and in the Pacific. In fact, the two most important battles of the war, I would argue, were in the Soviet Union and in the Pacific. And the war wasn't over until Japan surrendered, but we'll have more on that, of course, later. One of the single most important characteristics about the war is the level of destruction. Now, our best guess is between 45 to, I think, 70 million people died in World War II. This is going to date myself. When I was in college as an undergrad, 9/11 happened my freshman year of college. And as the Iraq War started to go up, we would come into class and there would be, free newspapers available to say, oh, this many hundreds died, this many troops died. And it was a big deal if it was more than 10. In World War II, it's hundreds that are perishing, thousands even. I was thinking, we get updates about every day, every week about the number of people who have been infected with COVID-19, numbers of people who are dying of this terrible, terrible virus. World War II was sort of like that, except on a larger scale. More people, both civilians and military, died in World War II than in any war in history. And beyond statistics, it was destructive on bodies, but also on cities and homelands. The world had seen what aerial bombardment on Guernica brought to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and they had recoiled in horror. But by 1945, aerial bombardment was part and parcel of the war strategy. In Hamburg, Germany, in 1943, 40,000 people were killed in 4 days from the aerial bombing. In fact, the air was so hot that it literally caught fire. And fires, they need oxygen, right? They drew oxygen from every source, including from air raid shelters. So many people who died in Hamburg died not from the bombings themselves, but from fires, asphyxiation. And of course, some of the biggest loss of civilian life was at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'm assigning you a documentary to watch called White Light, Black Rain, so that you can hear firsthand from survivors of those bombings. And of course, the millions who were killed in the concentration camps, definitely part of that total. Like World War I, World War II was also a war of machines. World War I brought out the appearance of tanks, planes, poison gas, and submarines. Well, World War II didn't really have so much the appearance of new weapons, with one major exception, of course, but the development and improvement of existing weapons. So radar was kind of new. Radios on the battlefield, you didn't really see that in World War I, but it was mostly the improvement of weapons. I say improvement in quotation marks. Now, connected to that, World War II was an industrial war. The United States manufactured 360,000 planes for the war effort. The United States manufactured over 136,000 tanks for Russia. In November of 1942, the United States was producing submarines faster than Germany and Japan could sink them. Something around 10% of Russian equipment was made in the United States. And the UK's equipment, about 60 to 70% was made in the United States. Ask your families, did they have someone involved in the war, in working in a factory, working in a shipyard, producing something for the war effort? I found out during an oral history project with my mom, when I was your age, that her mother had worked in a Wichita, Kansas Boeing manufacturing plant, making bombers. And I think there were B-52s. So she was one of those Rosie the Riveter types. The War of Machines also extended to military intelligence. The Enigma machine, the Nazis' code for sending out orders and intelligence, consumed the time of codebreakers at Bletchley Park in the United Kingdom. There, a workforce of 75% women and 1% Alan Turing broke the Nazi code with a machine called Ultra. The movie, The Imitation Game, came out a few years ago. It was about this story. Benedict Cumberbatch played Alan Turing. But like all Hollywood histories, don't get your history just from that. Alan Turing, great mind, awful story about the persecution of LGBT people in the 1940s and 1950s, but he's not the whole story of Bletchley Park. World War II was a war of racial ideologies. We've talked most about Nazi racial policies because of the Holocaust. And what may strike us as odd is that we are the most familiar with the death camps due to their liberation by Russian and United States forces. I mentioned that people knew about the concentration camps for political prisoners. I was actually just this weekend watching or rewatching Casablanca. It's one of the best American films of all time. One of the characters, Victor Laszlo, had been a prisoner in a concentration camp because of his anti-fascist political activities. Now, that movie was in 1942, so that's during the war, right? But that's before the liberation of the concentration camps. So people knew these concentration camps existed. They just didn't necessarily know all about the death camps as well. Now, when Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, heard about what his troops had found at a concentration camp, he immediately went there. And importantly, he brought in news crews and cameras and photography to record what he was seeing. Eisenhower later recalled, quote, "I visited every nook and cranny of the camp because I felt it my duty to be in a position from then on to testify at first hand about these things in case there ever grew up at home the belief or assumption that the stories of Nazi brutality were just propaganda. Some members of the visiting party were unable to go through the ordeal. I not only did so, but as soon as I returned to Patton's headquarters that evening, I sent communications to both Washington and London, urging the two governments to send instantly to Germany a random group of newspaper editors and representative groups from the national legislatures. I felt that the evidence should be immediately placed before the American and British publics in a fashion that would leave no room for cynical doubt." Anti-Semitism was central, not peripheral, to what Nazism represented. Concentration camps were the symbol of Nazi Germany. The Allied forces basically ignored the issue over the course of much of the war until about the end of the war, what we know as the end of the war, 1944, 1945. Right? Allies did not open their doors to Jewish refugees who were trying to flee Germany. The United States turned away a ship called the St. Louis. I think I've mentioned this before. The ship, the St. Louis, carried more than 900 Jewish refugees. In 1939, they went to Cuba trying to seek entry. They were not allowed in Cuba. This is before Cuba was communist. 1939, they were refused entry into Cuba. They went up then to Miami. American officials refused to allow them there. Eventually, the St. Louis had to make its way back to Europe. By 1945, half of the people who had been on the St. Louis were dead, sent to camps like Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Now, connected to this is another legacy of World War II, and that was the creation of Israel, which we'll actually get into more detail later. World War II was a coalition war. Now, how do you get multiple countries fighting together as one? I'm going to talk about some of the generals involved later on, but here, just this moment, I'm going to give a lot of credit to Dwight Eisenhower. Now, you guys know me. Over the course of the semester, I'm very big about like not giving just one person credit for a lot of things. I was just talking about Alan Turing not being the single story of Bletchley Park. But Dwight Eisenhower, I think, has to get a lot of credit. Once the United States was involved in World War II, Eisenhower took command of the Allied forces. He was able to get the Allies to put their ideologies and personalities aside for the common purpose of winning the war. Alright, finally, let's talk some legacies of the post-war world. Decolonization does not happen without World War II. World War II weakened the powers of colonial Europe. Great Britain was weakened, France was weakened. They were the two largest colonial empires. It was not an accident that India declared independence in 1947. It was not an accident that Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, as they were called then, declared independence in 1949. It would not have happened without World War II because the imperial nations were weakened by the war. If it would have happened, it would have happened much later. World War II brought about a sense of American omnipotence. Now, what does that mean? Think about this. The United States went into World War I rather reluctantly, only really at the end, helped to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, the whole 14 points thing, but then America kind of retreated back into isolationism. The United States stayed out of World War II from 1939 until 1941, didn't join the war really until 1942. But by 1945, May and August 1945, America took its stage as a world power, as an industrial power, as a military power. And the United States definitely shaped the ultimate outcome of the war. And because of that, the United States came to see itself as an omnipotent, all-powerful, could-not-be-defeated kind of nation. The Soviet Union couldn't defeat them, China couldn't defeat them, Germany couldn't defeat them, Japan couldn't defeat the United States. And that will lead the United States into military ventures that might not have been fought without that kind of sense of we will never be defeated. Vietnam. And alongside the kind of rise of American power is ushering in an atomic age. While the United States was developing atomic weapons, the Russians were developing atomic weapons. The fact of the matter is that nuclear weapons may have made war in the post-1945 world less likely. Wars between great powers, anyway. Don't see as many. There's the Cold War, but the United States and Russia never really went to blows against each other. The very terrible threat of a nuclear war made a war between these great powers less likely. And at the end of the war, there's this bipolarity. There's only two great powers left, the United States and the Soviet Union. And that would pretty much remain the case until the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union. World War II had a very decisive influence on shaping the world that emerged after 1945. World War II created the conditions for the United Nations in the post-war years. The United Nations replaced what most consider the failed League of Nations. By failing to prevent World War II, the League was judged a failure. Out of the ashes of the Second World War arose the United Nations. And the United States, of course, joined the United Nations. In fact, the United States hosts the United Nations in New York. Alright, I know this has been kind of a long lecture. We're going to stop here instead of talking about the legacies and the kind of overall themes of World War II. In the next lecture, we're actually going to pick up a little bit with the narrative, the story of World War II, and we're going to think about when does World War II begin? Because this is a big topic. It seems like it should have a pretty simple answer. I guarantee you it can't be that simple. Not in my class. All right, stay tuned for the next lecture.